You think folks in Appalachia only ate store-bought cereal and instant grits in the 1970s? Think again. These mountain kitchens served up some of the most ingenious, stick-to-your-ribs, and surprisingly sophisticated meals in American rural history. From hoa cakes to fried cornmeal mush that could fuel a full day's work, these aren't hillbilly. Let's dig into 25 hillbilly breakfast recipes you never knew were actually defining self-sufficient country life while Nixon was in the White House and disco was taking over the cities. Cathead biscuits. These massive drop biscuits got their name from being as big as a grown cat's head, and they were the foundation of every proper Appalachian breakfast in the early 70s. Mountain women mixed flour, lard, buttermilk, and a pinch of baking powder with their hands until just combined. Overworking meant tough biscuits, and that was unforgivable. They'd pinch off handfuls of dough, shape them roughly, and drop them onto a cast iron skillet greased with bacon drippings. Baked at high heat in a wood-fired oven, these biscuits emerged golden brown with crispy bottoms and fluffy layered insides that could soak up gravy, butter, or sorghum molasses. In eastern Kentucky coal country, miners' wives made cathead biscuits before dawn, packing extras in lunch pails for underground shifts. These weren't delicate tea biscuits. They were substantial, filling, and meant to satisfy appetites sharpened by hard physical labor. Today's southern restaurants charge premium prices for authentic cathead biscuits, but back then they were just Tuesday morning in the mountains. Before we move to next food, don't forget to subscribe our channel for upcoming videos. Redeye gravy ham biscuits. Redeye gravy looked exactly like its name suggested. Reddish brown with an oily sheen floating on top that resembled a bloodshot eye staring back at you. This was Depression-era ingenuity that survived well into the 1970s across Appalachia and the rural South. After frying thick slabs of country ham in a cast iron skillet, cooks deglaze the pan with yesterday's leftover coffee, scraping up all those caramelized, salty bits stuck to the bottom. The ham's fat, mixed with the bitter coffee, created a thin, intensely flavored gravy that was equal parts salty, smoky, and slightly bitter. The trick was using strong black coffee. Weak coffee made weak gravy. Families poured this concoction over split cathead biscuits or grits with extra ham slices on the side. In West Virginia mining towns, this breakfast could keep a man working underground for hours without thinking about food. The combination sounds strange to modern palates, but that marriage of coffee bitterness and ham saltiness created something oddly addictive that defined mountain mornings throughout the Nixon years. Hoe cakes. Hoe cakes earned their name from being cooked on the flat blade of a hoe held over an open fire, though by the 1970s, most folks used cast iron skillets instead. These were simple cornmeal pancakes, just cornmeal, water or buttermilk, salt, and sometimes a beaten egg mixed to a thick batter. The key was getting your skillet smoking hot with bacon grease before ladling in the batter, creating those crispy, lacy edges that contrasted with the tender center. Each hoe cake cooked fast, developing a golden brown crust that crackled when you bit through it. In Tennessee tobacco country, farmhands ate these standing up before heading to the fields at sunrise, often topped with nothing more than butter and a drizzle of sorghum. Poor families appreciated that hoe cakes required minimal ingredients. When money was tight and the pantry was nearly bare, you could still make breakfast as long as you had cornmeal. They weren't fancy, but they were filling, cheap, and connected directly to centuries of Southern agricultural tradition that survived industrialization and modern convenience foods. Chocolate gravy and biscuits. This sounds like dessert, but chocolate gravy was serious breakfast business in the Ozarks and Appalachian foothills during the early 70s. Women made it in cast iron skillets by mixing flour, cocoa powder, sugar, and milk into a thick, pudding-like gravy that they'd pour over split biscuits while still hot. The gravy was sweet, but not cloying, more like a thin chocolate pudding with a gravy's pourable consistency. The cocoa powder used was usually basic, unsweetened Hershey's cocoa, nothing fancy or European. Kids went wild for this breakfast, and mothers justified it because biscuits made it substantial enough to count as a real meal. In rural Arkansas, this was a Saturday morning tradition when farm families could afford a little sugar and cocoa. The hot gravy would seep into the biscuit's layers, creating a combination of textures: crispy biscuit tops with chocolate-soaked, pudding-soft bottoms. Modern foodies rediscovering this dish call it quirky Southern comfort food, but for mountain families, it was just what you made when the kids needed something special on a cold morning. Fried cornmeal mush. Leftover cornmeal mush from supper became breakfast gold when sliced thick and fried crispy in bacon grease. The process started the night before, cooking cornmeal with water and salt into a thick porridge, then pouring it into a loaf pan to solidify overnight. By morning, you had a firm loaf that sliced clean as bread. Those slices went into a screaming hot cast iron skillet where they developed a golden, crunchy crust while staying creamy inside. In the coal regions of West Virginia, miners' wives served these with fried eggs on top, the yolk breaking over the crispy mush slices. Some families ate it with sorghum molasses or homemade apple butter, while others preferred it savory with salt and pepper. This dish represented mountain thriftiness. Nothing got wasted, and yesterday's supper became today's breakfast with nothing more than a hot skillet and some grease. The contrast between that crackling exterior and soft interior made this more satisfying than it had any right to be, given its humble, three-ingredient origin. Tomato gravy on biscuits. When fresh tomatoes flooded mountain gardens in late summer, tomato gravy became a breakfast staple that carried families through to fall. Cooks started with bacon drippings in a cast iron skillet, adding flour to make a roux, then stirring in home-canned tomatoes with their juice until it thickened into a pinkish red gravy. Some added a pinch of sugar to cut the acidity, others preferred it tangy and sharp. The result was a savory, slightly sweet gravy with chunks of tomato throughout, seasoned with nothing more than salt and black pepper. In North Carolina tobacco country, this appeared on breakfast tables throughout the 1970s, especially when meat was scarce or money was tight. Ladled over fresh biscuits, it provided a filling breakfast that cost nearly nothing beyond the labor of canning tomatoes the previous summer. The gravy had a comfort food quality, familiar tomato flavor in an unexpected breakfast format. Today's farm-to-table restaurants serve versions of this, calling it heritage Southern cuisine, but mountain families just called it making do with what the garden gave you. Corn pone with butter drippings. Corn pone was hoe cake's denser, more substantial cousin, shaped by hand into thick oval patties rather than poured as thin pancakes. The batter was thicker, almost dough-like, made from just cornmeal, salt, and enough water or buttermilk to hold it together. Cooks shaped them with wet hands to prevent sticking, then fried them in deep bacon grease or butter until they developed a dark, almost burnt-looking crust. Inside, they stayed moist and grainy with that distinctive corn flavor that dominated. The butter drippings weren't melted butter. They were the brown, nutty bits left in the pan after frying butter, mixed with fresh butter and sometimes honey or molasses. In the Kentucky hollers, corn pone was breakfast for families too poor to afford wheat flour for biscuits. You ate it hot, split open, with those butter drippings seeping into every crevice. The texture was denser than cornbread, almost gritty, with a satisfying chew. This was survival food elevated by technique and tradition, proof that the poorest ingredients could still make a breakfast worth waking up for in 1972. Hot water. Cornbread. Hot water cornbread was the emergency breakfast when you had absolutely nothing else, just cornmeal, boiling water, and salt. The boiling water cooked the cornmeal slightly before frying, creating a texture impossible to achieve otherwise. Cooks poured boiling water over cornmeal and salt, stirred it into a thick paste, then shaped it into small patties and dropped them into a skillet filled with at least a half-inch of sizzling hot fat. They'd flattened slightly with a spatula, frying until the outside became shatteringly crisp and almost blistered. Inside, they stayed moist and creamy with an intense corn flavor. In the Appalachian coal fields during the early 70s economic downturns, this appeared on breakfast tables when families couldn't afford eggs, milk, or flour. The key was getting the fat hot enough, too cool, and they'd absorb grease and turn soggy, hot enough, and they'd form that crispy shell immediately. Eaten while scalding hot, they were addictive despite their simplicity. Modern food writers discovering this dish call it rustic and authentic, missing the point that it was just what you made when the paycheck hadn't come yet. Fried Bologna and egg sandwich. While suburbanites ate Bologna cold from plastic packages, country folks in the early 70s knew the secret. Frying thick-cut Bologna transformed it entirely. You'd slice it nearly half an inch thick and score the edges with a knife to prevent curling, then drop it into a hot cast-iron skillet. The Bologna would puff up, developing crispy, caramelized edges while staying juicy inside, releasing its salty, smoky fat into the pan. Then you'd crack eggs directly into that Bologna-flavored grease, frying them until the edges turned lacy and brown. The whole mess went between two slices of white bread, preferably squished flat, so the egg yolk soaked through both slices. In Tennessee and Kentucky, this was a Saturday morning tradition after working the farm all week. The Bologna was cheap. You could get the good, thick-cut kind from the local butcher for pennies. That combination of crispy Bologna, runny egg yolk, and grease-soaked bread created something far greater than its simple parts suggested. Today's artisan breakfast sandwiches can't touch the satisfaction of this working-class breakfast that cost maybe 50 cents to make. Johnny cakes. Johnny cakes were Rhode Island's gift to Appalachia, traveling down through New England as settlers moved south, becoming a mountain breakfast staple by the 1970s. Different from hoe cakes mainly in their thicker batter and smaller size, Johnny cakes were made from stone-ground cornmeal, milk or water, a bit of flour, and sometimes molasses for sweetness. The batter needed to be thick enough to hold a shape when spooned onto the griddle, creating cakes about 3 inches across and half an inch thick. Cooked on a well-seasoned griddle or cast-iron skillet, they developed a crispy crust while staying moist inside, with a texture somewhere between a pancake and cornbread. In the Virginia mountains, families ate these with butter and honey or alongside fried eggs and country ham. The stone-ground cornmeal made all the difference. It had a coarser texture and deeper corn flavor than modern, commercially milled meal. These were hearty enough to satisfy without being as heavy as biscuits, making them popular with farmhands who needed energy without feeling weighted down before a day of physical labor in the tobacco fields. Cornbread and milk. This wasn't a cooking technique, it was a meal, simple as that. Crumbled cornbread and a glass of cold buttermilk or sweet milk was breakfast, lunch, or supper for poor families throughout Appalachia in the early 1970s. You'd take leftover cornbread from yesterday's dinner, crumble it into a drinking glass or bowl, then pour in cold milk until the cornbread floated in it. Some folks added sugar or honey, others ate it plain, letting the cornbread slowly absorb the milk until it became soft and porridge-like. In eastern Kentucky coal towns, children ate this before school while their fathers ate Cathead biscuits. The kids got the cheaper breakfast. There was something oddly satisfying about the texture progression as you ate, starting with crunchy cornbread pieces that gradually softened into a sweet, corny mush. Older folks who grew up during the Depression never stopped eating this, even when they could afford better, because it reminded them of childhood and simpler times. Modern nutritionists would probably approve of its whole grain, dairy combination, but mountain families just knew it filled empty bellies cheaply and completely. Fried grit cakes. Leftover grits got a second life as fried grit cakes, another example of mountain thriftiness turning yesterday's supper into today's breakfast. After cooking grits with water, salt, and maybe some butter, you'd pour the hot grits into a loaf pan and refrigerate overnight. By morning, they'd solidified into a sliceable loaf that could be cut into half-inch slabs. These slices went into hot bacon grease in a cast iron skillet, frying until they developed a golden, crispy crust on both sides, while the interior stayed creamy. The contrast was everything, that crackling exterior giving way to smooth, corn-flavored softness. In South Carolina low country, families topped these with fried eggs and country ham, the yolk breaking over the crispy grits. Some folks ate them with syrup or molasses like pancakes. Others preferred them savory with salt and pepper. This represented the mountain principle that nothing got thrown away. Every leftover had potential for transformation. The key was getting the grits firm enough to slice cleanly and the pan hot enough to develop that crust without absorbing too much grease. Ash cakes. Ash cakes were the original frontier breakfast, still being made in remote Appalachian cabins well into the 1970s by the oldest generation who remembered their grandparents' ways. This was cornmeal, salt, and water mixed into a thick dough, shaped into flat cakes about half an inch thick, then wrapped in cabbage leaves or corn shucks and buried directly in the hot ashes of a fireplace. The protective wrapping prevented the cakes from getting too ashy while allowing them to cook through from the radiant heat. After about 20 minutes, you'd rake them out, brush off the ash, unwrap them, and eat them steaming hot. They'd have a slightly smoky flavor and a texture denser than cornbread, almost chewy. In the most remote Kentucky hollers where families still cooked in fireplaces rather than on stoves, this was how the oldest grandmother made breakfast while everyone else slept. The ash added minerals and a subtle flavor impossible to replicate in modern ovens. This was living history, a cooking technique unchanged since the 1700s, persisting into the era of moon landings and color television. Fried apples with biscuits. When September came to the mountains and apple trees hung heavy with fruit, fried apples became a breakfast staple that lasted through winter. Cooks sliced apples thick, peel and all, and fried them in butter or bacon grease in a cast iron skillet until they caramelized and turned golden. They'd add brown sugar or white sugar, a pinch of cinnamon, and sometimes a splash of water to create a syrupy sauce. The apples would soften but still hold their shape, becoming tender and sweet with slightly crispy edges. The whole mixture got spooned over split biscuits, the apple syrup soaking into the biscuit layers. In North Carolina, this appeared on Sunday morning breakfast tables throughout the early 70s, especially when families had worked the orchards all week. The combination of buttery biscuits and sweet tart apples created something special. Not quite dessert, not quite breakfast, but perfect for both. Some families added raisins during cooking, others kept it pure apple. This was one dish where even poor families could create something that felt luxurious, since apples grew wild or in every backyard orchard across the mountains. Grits with Redeye gravy. Pouring Redeye gravy over a bowl of steaming grits created one of the most distinctively Appalachian breakfasts. Bitter, salty, smoky, and completely addictive once you developed a taste for it. The grits needed to be cooked properly, not instant, but stone-ground corn simmered slowly with water and salt until they reached a creamy consistency thick enough to hold a spoon upright. Then came the Redeye gravy, that coffee and ham fat mixture that looked unappetizing but tasted like pure country morning. The gravy's oily surface would pool on top of the white grits, creating a marbled pattern. Each spoonful combined the grits' mild corn flavor with the gravy's intense saltiness and coffee bitterness. In Tennessee and Kentucky, this fueled men through entire shifts at factories and farms. The caffeine from the coffee gravy gave you a jolt, while the grits provided lasting energy. Yankees who tried this for the first time usually hated it. The flavor combination was too foreign, too intense. But mountain folks raised on it craved it, understanding that some tastes are acquired through generations, not chosen rationally. Liver mush with eggs and grits. Liver mush was North Carolina's answer to scrapple, a loaf made from pork liver, head meat, cornmeal, and spices, cooked down and molded until solid. By the early 70s, you could buy it sliced at any country store throughout the Piedmont and mountain regions. Sliced thick and fried in bacon grease, liver mush developed a crispy, dark crust while staying soft and savory inside. The flavor was distinctly livery, earthy, mineral-rich, and intense, not for the faint of heart. Served alongside fried eggs and creamy grits, this was a protein-packed breakfast for working men who needed calories to burn. Some folks couldn't stand the liver taste, but others craved it, appreciating its richness and depth. The trick was frying it hot and fast to develop that crust, otherwise it could turn mushy and unappetizing. In textile mill towns throughout Carolina, this appeared in lunch pails alongside biscuits, marking regional identity as clearly as any accent. Today, artisanal butchers sell liver mush at farmers' markets for premium prices, calling it heritage protein. But in 1972, it was just Tuesday's breakfast on the cheap. Fried salt pork with eggs. Salt pork was the poor man's bacon. Pork belly cured in salt but not smoked, cheaper and more readily available in country stores throughout Appalachia. To prepare it, you'd slice it thin, soak the slices briefly in water to remove excess salt, then fry them in a cast iron skillet until crispy. They'd render their fat as they cooked, creating grease for frying eggs. The salt pork had a cleaner pork flavor than bacon without the smokiness, and an almost crystalline crispiness when fried properly. The eggs went into the rendered pork fat, frying until the edges turned brown and lacy. Together, served with biscuits or cornbread, this was breakfast in eastern Kentucky coal country throughout the 70s. The salt pork was incredibly salty, sometimes almost too salty even after soaking. But that was the point, providing flavor when other seasonings weren't available. Families appreciated that salt pork lasted months without refrigeration, hanging in root cellars wrapped in cloth. This was Depression-era frugality, persisting decades later, not from nostalgia, but from economic necessity in regions where good jobs remained scarce. Fried hominy with bacon and eggs. Canned hominy, those big puffy corn kernels treated with lye, became breakfast when drained and fried until crispy in bacon grease. The hominy would develop golden brown spots where it touched the hot skillet, staying soft inside, while the outside developed a slight crunch. The lye treatment gave hominy a distinctive flavor, slightly alkaline and mineral tasting, very different from regular corn. Fried with bacon and eggs, it created a breakfast plate that looked fancy, but cost pennies. In the Ozarks and southern Appalachia, this appeared on weekend mornings when families wanted something different from the usual biscuits and gravy. The hominy absorbed bacon flavor as it fried, becoming richer and more savory than its bland canned state suggested. Some folks added onions and peppers to the skillet, others kept it simple. The texture was key, each kernel tender, but with enough firmness to bite through. This dish represented how country cooks could take industrial canned goods and transform them through traditional cooking methods into something that felt homemade and authentic, bridging the gap between old ways and modern convenience. Spoon bread. Spoon bread was breakfast for special occasions, Sunday mornings or when the preacher came to visit, because it required eggs, milk, butter, and cornmeal when most breakfasts used just one or two ingredients. This was essentially a cornmeal souffle, light and airy, baked in a cast iron skillet until the top browned and the inside stayed creamy. The name came from its texture. Too soft to slice, it had to be spooned onto plates while hot. Making it required whisking egg whites to stiff peaks and folding them gently into a cornmeal milk butter mixture before baking. When done right, spoon bread rose dramatically in the oven, developing a golden crust while staying custardy inside. The texture was impossibly light and delicate, almost cloud-like, with a subtle corn sweetness. In Virginia mountain towns, this appeared on Christmas morning alongside country ham and red-eye gravy. Families ate it with butter melting on top or with syrup drizzled over like pancakes. This represented mountain cooking at its most refined, taking humble cornmeal and elevating it through technique into something elegant enough for special occasions, proving country cooks had skills that matched any city chef. Sawbelly and fried eggs. Sawbelly was exactly what it sounds like. Salt-cured pork belly, cheaper and fattier than even salt pork, used when money ran desperately short. It came in slabs covered with thick, hard fat that needed to be sliced thin and fried slowly to render properly. The meat itself was layered with fat, becoming incredibly crispy when cooked long enough, with a flavor intensely salty and porky. Most of the slice would melt away into grease, leaving just crispy bits of meat and fat. Those crispy bits got eaten with fried eggs cooked in the rendered fat, usually served over biscuits or cornbread to soak up the grease. In the poorest Appalachian counties during economic downturns of the early 70s, this was breakfast when nothing else was available. The sawbelly cost almost nothing and provided fat for cooking when butter couldn't be afforded. The resulting breakfast was undeniably greasy and heavy, designed to fuel hard physical labor rather than taste delicate or refined. Modern health consciousness has eliminated sawbelly from most diets, but in 1972 mountain kitchens, it represented survival and making do. Eating it wasn't about preference, but about necessity and tradition. Venison sausage patties. In mountain regions where deer hunting remained a way of life rather than a hobby, venison sausage was breakfast meat throughout fall and winter. Hunters would grind venison with pork fat, venison being too lean on its own, adding sage, black pepper, and salt before forming the mixture into patties. These fried up in cast iron skillets, developing a dark, crispy crust while staying juicy inside with a distinctively gamey flavor stronger than pork sausage. The meat tasted of the forest, earthy, slightly wild, and rich in a way domestic meat couldn't match. In West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, this was the breakfast that proved a man could still provide for his family through hunting, maintaining traditions going back centuries. Families served it alongside eggs, biscuits, and gravy, with the sausage's strong flavor dominating the plate. Making venison sausage was a social event. Neighbors gathering after deer season to grind meat, argue about seasoning ratios, and drink coffee while the work progressed. This represented self-sufficiency at its purest, relying on wild game rather than store-bought meat, and connecting families to the land in ways supermarket shopping never could. Sawmill gravy. Sawmill gravy got its name from lumber camps where it was made in huge batches to feed crews of loggers, though by the 70s, every mountain family had their own version. The base was simple, flour browned in bacon grease or sausage drippings, with milk added slowly while whisking constantly to prevent lumps. The result was a thick white gravy, heavily speckled with black pepper, sometimes with crumbled sausage mixed in. The flavor was simple but addictive, salty, peppery, and rich with pork fat. Poured over biscuits, it soaked in and created layers of flavor and texture impossible to achieve otherwise. In Tennessee, logging towns, this appeared on breakfast tables daily, fueling men through dangerous work cutting timber. The gravy needed to be thick enough to cling to biscuits without running off, but thin enough to pour easily. Every cook had her own preferred consistency. Some added extra pepper until the gravy tasted almost spicy. Others kept it milder. This was poverty food elevated to art form, proving that the simplest ingredients could create something deeply satisfying when prepared with skill and tradition passed down through generations. Hominy. This swollen, pearl-white corn looked like something from another planet, but it packed more nutrition punch than regular corn could ever deliver. Mountain families learned hominy making from Cherokee neighbors in the early 1800s, particularly in eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. The process involved soaking dried field corn in lye water made from hardwood ashes for days until the hulls loosened and the kernels puffed up like white balloons. Women would carefully pour boiling lye water over dried corn kernels in large iron pots, stirring with wooden paddles as the caustic solution loosened the tough outer shells. After days of soaking and multiple rinses in fresh spring water, the kernels emerged transformed, doubled in size, ghostly white, and tender enough to chew. The finished hominy could be boiled into a hearty porridge, fried crispy in pork fat, or dried again for winter storage. Modern canned hominy is a pale shadow of the hand-processed mountain variety. Apple stack cake. No mountain wedding was complete without this towering testament to community cooperation and Appalachian ingenuity. This wasn't just dessert, it was edible architecture that could feed 50 people. Apple stack cake originated in the 1800s when sugar was expensive and hard to come by in mountain communities. Instead of traditional frosting, this cake relied on dried apples cooked down into a thick, spiced filling that acted as both flavor and mortar between thin cake layers. Each wedding guest would bring a layer, and the bride's family would provide the apple filling made from dried apples, slow-cooked with molasses, cinnamon, and sometimes a splash of moonshine. The cake was assembled like a skyscraper, with 6 to 12 thin layers stacked high and sealed together with the sticky apple mixture. After assembly, the entire cake was wrapped in cloth and left to season for days, allowing the flavors to meld and the layers to soften. The finished product looked like a sweet mountain peak and tasted like concentrated autumn. Squirrel and dumplings. When winter meat supplies ran low, mountain families turned to the abundant squirrels that populated every hollow and ridge. This dish transformed small game into a hearty meal that could stretch to feed unexpected company. Squirrel hunting was a rite of passage for mountain boys, and preparing squirrel and dumplings was considered essential knowledge for mountain wives. The process began with cleaning and jointing 2 or 3 squirrels, then browning the pieces in bacon grease until golden. The meat was covered with water and simmered with wild onions and herbs until tender enough to fall off the bone. Meanwhile, dumplings were made from simple ingredients: flour, salt, and enough water or milk to form a stiff dough that could be rolled thin and cut into strips. These dumplings were dropped into the bubbling squirrel broth, where they puffed up and absorbed the rich, gamey flavor. The finished dish featured tender meat swimming in thick, dumpling-studded gravy that tasted like comfort itself. One pot could feed a family for 2 meals, making it economical as well as delicious. Turtle soup with cornbread. Mountain streams and ponds provided more than just water. They offered protein in the form of snapping turtles that could weigh 20 pounds or more. This wasn't backwoods desperation food. Turtle soup was considered a delicacy that rivaled anything served in fancy city hotels. Catching snapping turtles required courage and skill, as these prehistoric-looking creatures could snap off fingers with their powerful jaws. Once caught, the turtle was cleaned and the meat removed from the shell, revealing surprisingly tender flesh that tasted like a cross between chicken and fish. The preparation was elaborate, befitting its special status. The turtle meat was cut into chunks and slowly simmered with wild onions, herbs, and root vegetables until it fell apart. Some cooks added hard-boiled eggs and a splash of vinegar for tang. The finished soup was thick, rich, and deeply flavorful, served alongside fresh cornbread to soak up every drop. Turtle soup was reserved for special occasions and honored guests, proving that mountain cuisine could rival any city restaurant when ingredients and skill combined. Fried catfish and hush puppies. Mountain streams provided more than just cool water. They were home to whiskered catfish that became the centerpiece of legendary fish fries that brought entire communities together. These weren't delicate trout fishing expeditions. Catching catfish required patience, strong hands, and sometimes the courage to reach into dark holes where big cats lurked. Fresh-caught catfish were cleaned and skinned, revealing firm, white meat that was surprisingly sweet and mild despite the fish's muddy reputation. The fillets were soaked in buttermilk to remove any earthy taste, then dredged in seasoned cornmeal that created a golden, crunchy coating when fried in hot lard. Alongside the fish came hush puppies, cornmeal fritters mixed with chopped onions and dropped by spoonfuls into the same hot fat. Legend says hush puppies got their name from cooks who tossed them to barking dogs with the command, "Hush puppies." The combination of crispy outside, flaky inside catfish with hot, sweet hush puppies created a meal that satisfied both body and soul, proving that mountain cuisine could compete with any coastal seafood. Leather britches. Don't let the name fool you. These weren't pants, but green beans transformed into leathery strips that could hang from the rafters all winter long. This preservation method turned summer's abundance into winter sustenance without requiring expensive canning equipment or precious salt. The process began during peak bean season, when mountain gardens produced more fresh beans than families could eat. Young, tender green beans were strung on heavy thread using a large needle, creating long garlands that looked like green necklaces. These bean strings were hung from kitchen rafters, porch ceilings, or attic beams where air could circulate freely around them. Over several weeks, the beans dried into brown, wrinkled strips that rattled like leather when touched, hence the name leather britches. Come winter, handfuls of the dried beans were soaked overnight to rehydrate, then cooked slowly with fatback or bacon until tender. The finished beans had a concentrated, slightly smoky flavor that fresh beans couldn't match. This ancient preservation method kept families fed with vegetables long after gardens lay buried under snow. Southern beans and cornbread. This wasn't just a meal, it was the foundation of mountain survival, a perfect protein combination that could sustain families through the leanest times. The magic happened when dried beans and cornmeal joined forces, creating a complete protein that rivaled expensive meat in nutritional value. Mountain families grew their own beans, usually tough varieties like pintos or navy beans that could withstand harsh weather and poor soil. These dried beans were soaked overnight, then slow-cooked for hours with a piece of fatback or ham hock until they became creamy and rich.